All right, guys. Good to see everybody on a dark Wednesday evening. Somebody told me all the paving stuff was over. I've been in the building since about 1 o'clock. Did y'all encounter any paving equipment on the way in on Houston Levee? It was all out of the way? Okay. Y'all, I left. I know this is terribly interesting. It takes me about 15 minutes to get from my house here when I come to work in the morning. It's exactly 7 miles from my driveway to the spot where I usually park. On Tuesday, because they're paving Houston Levee, a 15-minute drive took me almost 45 minutes. It was awful. And so there you go. It was terrible. I'm not used to traffic like that anymore. So, Ezra chapter 4. Y'all turn to Ezra chapter 4. And this is an interesting chapter in that it's kind of confusing because what the writer does, and y'all notice that we haven't even gotten to Ezra yet. Like, he hadn't shown up. He's not going to show up till chapter 5. And for him to show up actually take a pretty far leap in time, almost 20 years from where we started at the beginning of this book. So here in Ezra chapter 4, the people have been sent back from the Babylonian exile. Not everybody went back, but quite a few did. So, tens of thousands of people. And they go back, and we just left them last week having laid the foundation of the temple. And after they laid the foundation of the temple, we saw where some people celebrated and some cheered and were very happy. Those who were older, who had seen the first temple, actually wept because they realized it was not going to be as amazing, as wonderful as the original Solomon's temple was going to be. And so you had this mix of emotions there at the end of chapter 3. When we come to chapter 4, the writer is going to continue to talk about what's going on with this part of Ezra. And then around verse 7, he's going to jump way forward in time to tell us about something that's going to happen in the future, really by way of illustration, that God's people always have opposition. And then he's going to come back to the time that we're in. It's a really odd deal and can be a little bit confusing to try to figure out who everybody is and what's going on. So we're going to take it slowly, but ultimately I give you the point of the thing first. So as we don't get bogged down in the details. And it's simply God's people should expect opposition to following God's plan. When you and I seek to do God's will, we should not be surprised that the world, that Satan, our flesh, whatever it might be, is going to oppose what we're trying to do. And that's what we see in this chapter. The people around them are going to oppose the rebuilding of the temple to the point where they're going to stop building. And it's going to take Haggai and Zechariah to get them back to work. But that comes years later. So that's where we are. I know that's all as clear as mud. But that's where we are. So, Ezra chapter 4 and verse 1. Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. And we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." Now that sounds real nice, but let's see what Zerubbabel says. But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses in Israel said to them, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." So there's a lot of context going on here. And they let us know, the writer lets us know from the beginning, these are not friendly people. They're called adversaries, or your translation might say enemies. So we get some theological insight into who they are. So they get word and hear that the temple's being rebuilt. They show up and say, hey, we worship Yahweh too. We worship the Lord. Let's help. We want to help you build. The problem is they talk about how they have been doing this ever since this king of Assyria brought them here. Well, basically, the New Testament refers to these people as Samaritans. And it'll get more specific for the Samaritans as we go, because they're even more pagan. You know, the Samaritans in the New Testament had a false version of Judaism. These folks have the missionary term is they're engaging in syncretism. They're basically taking all the pagan gods along with the Jewish God and worshiping in them all. So they really think that they can say, we worship your God too. The problem is they're also worshiping a whole bunch of other gods. And so that's why that Zerubbabel says, look, we can't have anything to do with you, because they don't actually believe the same way. I'll show you a little bit of it. Head left in your Bible over to 2 Kings, chapter 17. 2 Kings 17, I'm going to pick up in verse 6 and then jump way down to verse 33 after I read a few verses in the beginning here. 2 Kings 17:6 says, in the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Hala on the Habor, the river Gozan, in the city of the Medes. And then it says in verse 7, and this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods. So those are the northern tribes, not Judah and Benjamin that we just read about in Ezra. Those are the northern tribes in the 700s BC. They're wiped out. The people that wiped them out then repopulated that area. And ultimately, that's where the Samaritans come from that we see in the New Testament. But look at verse 33 of chapter 17. After these people have been resettled in Samaria, it says, so they feared the Lord, but also served their own gods, after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away. So they served and tried to worship Yahweh at the same time as worshiping their other gods. Those are the kind of people who are showing up and saying, we worship like you do. Let's build this temple together. There's an important application to make here for us as Christians. We've got to be careful that cults who claim to be Christians don't fall into, or we don't allow them to fall into working with us. So for instance, Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses like to use the same language we do, but they don't mean the same thing we mean. They are not us. They are not Bible-believing Christians. They believe in a false God. They would say, however, that we're all on the same page. Sorry, I'm trying not to sneeze. So it's really important to know what people believe about whatever. The core is it. Do they believe in the deity of Christ? Do they believe that salvation is by grace through faith? Do they believe that the Bible is the inerrant word? Do they believe, you just pick all those core things that define what is Christianity. So when you start to investigate a cult, whether it's Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses or just some cult that somebody made up that claims to be Christians, you can always first go to say, okay, what do they believe about Jesus? And that's where they're going to mess up. That's the easiest check, is what do they believe about Jesus? Because if they believe the right things about Jesus, everything else falls in place. So, if you're a cult like Jehovah's Witness and you believe that Jesus is a created being, well, that's a problem, because Jesus is eternal. Mormonism basically has this weird doctrine of the Father and the Son and how the Son came about, and it's just, the whole thing's messed up. It's really kind of gross. So false belief about Jesus. You're going to find that over and over again in different cults. But they'll try to politically and other things say, well, we're together in this thing. Well, that only goes so far. We might push the same button in the voting booth, but we cannot worship together. This is not a thing. I remember hearing about a pastor who lost his church because he refused to, it was a small town, he had refused to they were doing annual like pulpit swap. You know, like the Methodist preacher would go to the Baptist church and the Baptist preacher would go to the Methodist church and that kind of thing. Well, the Mormon church was involved in that and he refused. He's like, oh, no, they can't come in here. And his church fired him because he stood up for the truth. You know, but for them, it was more just of a small town thing of, you know, it's just part of the community. And he's trying to make a theological point. And he was right. So you and I have to make sure. And so Zerubbabel here and Jeshua and the other heads, they understand who's coming to them. They understand we're not on the same page here. We're not worshiping the same God. We are not the same thing. So that's why they say no. Verse 4. Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purposes all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even till the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So now he's giving us some dates here. So let me give you some of these. He mentions first Cyrus. Cyrus is going to rule till about 530 BC. This is all 538 BC. So remember that BC goes backwards. You know, the bigger the number, you're further back in time. So that's when Cyrus comes along. Darius is actually from 522 to 486. So way past what we're going to deal with here in Ezra and all of that. And Nehemiah is going to come along in the 440s. So it's an interesting thing. So he tells us that this opposition is going to be around for a long time. Then he gives us an example of it that really doesn't impact the story of Ezra going forward. It gives us an illustration of the fact that people oppose God's people. And so he tells us in verse 6, he steps out of time and begins to tell us something that happened. Hold on just a second. He says in verse 6, in the reign of Ahasuerus, at the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Now, who is Ahasuerus? Well, Ahasuerus is Xerxes from Esther. He's the guy that Esther was married to. You remember that story? That's that guy. So he was from 486. Let me see what I got here. 486 to 465. So all we're told is that during his time there was an accusation. So there was opposition. Then in verse 7 we get something else. In the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam and Mithridath, don't y'all love these? And Tabeel and the rest of the associates wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. The letter was written in Aramaic and translated. So Artaxerxes, he's the one who ultimately will be the guy to send Nehemiah to go rebuild the wall. But here, he's going to do the opposite. And this is before Nehemiah. He's going to make them stop what they're doing. So here's what happens. And then remember, this is all future. I know it's confusing. This is all future to what's happening with the temple being rebuilt. We're just getting an example of the opposition. So verse 8. Rehum, the commander, and Shemaiah, the scribe, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes, the king, as follows. Rehum, the commander, and Shemaiah, the scribe, and the rest of the associates, the judges, the governors, the officials, the Persians, the men of Erech, the Babylonians, the men of Susa, that is, the Elamites, and the rest of the nations, whom the great and noble Onsnapper deported and settled in the cities of Samaria and in the rest of the province beyond the river. This is the copy of the letter that they sent. And then here it is. To Artaxerxes the king, your servants, the men of the province beyond the river, send greetings. And now be it known to the king that the Jews who came up from you to us have gone to Jerusalem. They are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. So this is all very, some propaganda people wrote this. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Most likely, these wall repairs are the walls that are torn down that Nehemiah then rebuilds. That's probably what's going on here. Now be it known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls finished, that they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and the royal revenue will be impaired. You always hit a politician where they're most sensitive, in the pocketbook. That's what they're doing. So this is, on their part, this is very effective. Verse 14, now because we eat the salt of the palace, which is a way of saying you support us. You make sure that we're okay. You give us money. It is not fitting for us to witness the king's dishonor. King, we're so beholding to you, it is our duty to make sure that you know about this. Therefore, we send and inform the king in order that search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers. You will find in the book of the records and learn that this city, so we're talking about Jerusalem, is a rebellious city, hurtful to kings and provinces, that sedition was stirred up in it from of old. This is why this city was laid waste. We made known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls finished, then, or you will then have no possession in the province beyond the river. So they're saying, king, if you don't deal with these people, you're not going to be in charge here anymore. You're not going to send you any more money. Everything's going to be down. So the king responds. Verse 17. The king sent an answer to Rehum the commander, and Shemaiah the scribe, and the rest of their associates who live in Samaria and in the rest of the province beyond the river. Greetings. And now the letter that you sent to us has been plainly read before me. And I made a decree, and search has been made, and it has found that this city from of old has risen against kings, and that rebellion and sedition have been made in it. And that's true. If you read through the book of Judges, there are many times where the Israelites rise up against their people, and there are times when other kings, when you get into 1st and 2nd Kings, where other nations come in and subdue them, and then those kings rebel. He's right. Verse 20, and mighty kings have been over Jerusalem. So he's probably thinking, David, Solomon, he knows about them, who ruled over the whole province beyond the river, to whom tribute, custom, and toll were paid. So most likely thinking about Solomon. Therefore make a decree that these men be made to cease, and that this city be not rebuilt until, and he throws this out, because he might be a king, but he is a politician, until a decree is made by me. So he leaves out the possibility that we actually see play out in Nehemiah. He's saying, you tell them to stop unless I say otherwise at some point. So he's got it in writing that he can't be accused of being a flip-flopper. Verse 22. And take care not to be slack in this matter. Why should damage grow to the hurt of the king? Then the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and Shemaiah the scribe and their associates. They went in haste to the Jews at Jerusalem, and by force and power made them cease. And then we go all the way back to where we started. In verse 24 is actually connected to verse 26 chronologically. What he's about to say in verse 24 applies to where we've been in Ezra with the rebuilding and the laying of the foundation of the temple. So here's what he says. Then the work on the house of God that is in Jerusalem stopped, and it ceased until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia, which is around 520 BC, which is when God tells Haggai to start preaching, and Zechariah starts preaching, and that gets the people to actually start to work again. The book of Haggai, he'll prophesy and say, you're living in paneled houses, and yet the house of God lays desolate. So they haven't done anything for like 18 years when Haggai starts to prophesy. So they stop it here. And that's when we get to chapter 5, when you get Haggai and Zechariah and Ezra and everybody else involved. So what chapter 4 is, as I talked about in the beginning, is the fact that when God's people set out to do what God has called them to do, we should expect opposition. Because what's the temple? Well, it's the same thing we've been talking about on Sunday night as the tabernacle. It's a picture of Christ. That's what it is. And so Satan doesn't want anything that represents Jesus to be rebuilt. He doesn't want the gospel spread. He doesn't want the truth of the Bible spread. And so people oppose God's people. So back to the point that I mentioned in the beginning. God's people should expect opposition to following God's plan. Now, here's what Jesus had to say about that. In Matthew 5, y'all, sorry about my throat. Matthew 5:11. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So those who work and serve on God's behalf often face persecution. So John 15:20, Jesus says, remember the word that I said to you, a servant's not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. If Jesus was persecuted, and we know he was, ultimately he was killed, you and I should not be surprised when we encounter opposition, when we encounter persecution. Now, we as a country have been blessed in that we have religious freedom. Now, that doesn't mean that personally, maybe there are times when you have been mistreated because of your faith in Christ. Maybe you have people in your family who think you're stupid because you believe the Bible. That happens. Maybe you have people at work or people that you worked with who think that you're foolish for what you do and for the standards you live by and for believing that God created the world and believing that the Bible is true and that there's only one way to heaven and all those things that you and I hold to be what God has called us to do. There are those who oppose that. We haven't had a lot of you can't preach that and you can't do that. That we're not to that point. We may get there. We might get there. You never know, especially in our day and time when any thought or word that triggers or offends anybody is thought as you can't say that. Well, I hadn't read the Constitution in a couple of years, but I don't think they've changed it. And we do have freedom of religion. We do have freedom of speech. We don't have freedom to not be offended. That's a different deal, right? And so truth offends. The cross is an offense. I mean, that's what Paul said. So we're going to, experience those things. And other countries already have, where certain things are classified as hate speech and that sort of deal. If you preach against certain things and that. So you don't know where it's coming from. I've also heard of, where towns will try to, keep churches from, building or expanding because if they build on that piece of property, that's a loss of tax revenue because something else can't be built there. So people are opposed to churches building. There's a lot of little small ways that you and I can be persecuted. But throughout the rest of the world, there are people who are dying, who are being killed for the faith. It's still a thing. Typically, it's worse in totalitarian governments, Muslim governments, that sort of deal, because it happens in Mexico all the time. When Christians try to stand up to the drug cartels, they kill them. So just across the border, there are believers who are killed for standing up for what's right and ultimately lose their life because of it. So it's not that far away. We should never be surprised when the truth of the gospel is mocked or opposed. It's been the norm for Christianity. What we have in the United States is the exception when it comes to the history of Christianity. It is absolutely the exception. We should be grateful for that. We should never take it for granted. And God has given us that responsibility, and we have a lot of stewardship because of it. But what the writer of Ezra is telling us is, this is what happens. When God's people get together and begin to do something that he's told them to do, Satan's going to stir up some opposition. So, you and I just need to decide beforehand, when the opposition comes, how are we going to stand up to it? What are we going to do? If we're told, you can't teach this, you can't preach this, or you're going to go to jail, well, there's a lot of Baptists that went to jail in 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. They went to jail. You know, it's just a thing. I don't want to go to jail. Y'all don't either. But ultimately, I don't think that'll happen in our lifetime, but you never know. You know, are we willing to not advance our career as far because there's certain things we won't do or certain ways we won't act? Where does it play out? You've got to make those decisions beforehand. Am I going to serve Jesus first and let the consequences fall where they may in this world, knowing that in the next there is that reward? We have to make those decisions ahead of time because there is opposition always for God's people. So on that up note, just know that in chapter 5, they start to rebuild again. We're just not getting to the positive stuff tonight. We will in a couple weeks. But, you know, it's they will get back on board. They will rebuild the temple, and it'll be a great thing. God's people will stand up to this opposition. But that's where we're gonna stop tonight. So for those of you who are watching online, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, thank you all for being here. We're going to log off in just a minute, but if you have any questions, send me an email to John, John, at mycbcc.org, and hopefully I can answer any questions. But we're going to have our prayer time now here in the sanctuary, so we're going to log